You're listening to Idea Collider, a show that explores the world of asymmetric learning. On this show, I will sit down with pharmaceutical experts and business leaders to discuss how to embrace uncertainty and the different learning style that follows. I'm your host, Mike Rea. Let's get into the show. Welcome to Idea Collider, another in the series of Pharma Book Club. I'm delighted to kind of return to the series with Billy Kenber and his book, Sick Money, The Truth About the Global Pharmaceutical Industry, which from the cover, I wasn't sure what to expect, but as soon as you got into the sort of depth and the nuance and the things I didn't know about some of our very recent history, I was very pleased to find it was, well researched and thoughtful. So I'll be keen to draw from Billy some more of the kind of major talking points, maybe talk us through the book and give us all a reason to read it. So Billy, welcome. And
Hi,
could you tell us something about yourself and your journey to this book?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be here. So my day job is working at the Times newspaper as an investigative journalist, which as it maybe sounds, is quite a sort of wide-ranging brief. We kind of look at lots of different topics. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I started to look at medicines pricing in the UK. I was actually particularly looking for what they call pay-for-delay deals, where a branded medicine pays off competitors to delay bringing in competition. And what I found through that reporting was not so much pay for delay, but a kind of price hiking scandal in the vein of Martin Shkreli in the US, where a group of companies had discovered that if you take a branded medicine and debrand it, so relaunch it as an unbranded generic, then under the NHS pricing rules, you're no longer restricted in what you do with the price. And they were putting prices up in some cases by thousands of percent, and doing this again and again across a number of products for a number of years. And that's ended up costing the NHS at least £1 billion in the extra cost of those old medicines. And so kind of inevitably with investigative journalism, you start writing about something and you kind of go off on tangents from there, and people get in touch with you, you do research, you read a lot of documents. And the more I sort of read and wrote about this specific, quite kind of narrow phenomenon, the more I realized that this wasn't just a few bad actors, but it was symptomatic of a lot of things that had changed in the pharmaceutical industry, and that this model, which got generated a lot of enthusiasm, particularly in the US and Canada, but also in the UK from investors and from private equity and from other interested parties, had a story to tell about R&D not being worth it anymore financially, about the pricing inelasticity in the industry, about the way that drug development had changed from being entirely in-house to being acquisitions based. And that all those things were indicative of these big changes that had occurred in the industry, and that I think many people that aren't paying close attention hadn't noticed. So the book, in simple terms, is there's a narrative element which explores the rise and fall of this sort of spec pharma boom, as it's known in the US, this sort of price hiking model, and then there's really the core of it is a kind of much deeper dive, looking back, starting really from the Second World War onwards, but a little bit before that, looking at how the industry has changed, both in terms of cultural changes and in terms of the scientific challenges that have kind of reshaped the way that drug companies go about their business. And then there's a look too at what we might do to fix some of these problems that have arisen. So that's kind of the book in a nutshell. It's aimed really at to some extent a general readership. It doesn't assume a great deal of knowledge in advance, but it does I hope get into some of the weeds and the nuances, because you can't really tell this story or explore these issues without kind of getting fairly in depth. It's a complicated and opaque industry.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. As someone who sits inside the industry, I think a lot of us aren't aware of, very recent history as well as, old history. But certainly the kind of, and I think you do this in the book, you sort of pull apart this idea that it's a sort of monolithic industry, that all companies are the same, which, certainly when it's attacked, it's often attacked as, it's all one thing. But I'd be interested in maybe going back to that, Shkreli story, because it feels like everyone should know it. I remember arguing with a guy a long time ago on Twitter when he was just a normal asshole, and having that argument with him. But and then I wrote a piece after he'd been found out in Stat, which was why we should listen to Martin Shkreli, because there was a piece came out where he said basically, look, I've been doing this, yes, and I'm not going to offer a defense of that, but just so you know, I'm not the only one doing it. The others have just done it with lower percentages than I have. And he told the case of a few drugs that he tried to buy and couldn't, and the originator noticed what he was going to do and decided to do it themselves. So, my piece was basically, he's wrong, but he's not all wrong about the kind of, the way that the industry behaves. He's just calling it out, and we liked having a scapegoat for all of the ills of the industry and the evils of the industry. But certainly there was the line wasn't just drawn at him, and there was a lot more going on. So, I'd love to, hear you elaborate a little bit on the kind of starting point, your house near Lake Ontario.
Yes, exactly. So this is a company that was called Concordia. It's had some name changes since then in light of what happened and what ultimately went wrong. But this was essentially, if you like, a sort of mini Valeant, if that's a slightly better known company. And what both of those companies did was grew very quickly by acquiring old medicines that either Big Pharma was no longer interested in, or often they'd already been divested and changed hand a few times. And then, quite simply, they'd hike the prices. Sometimes there'd be big increases overnight. So Martin Shkreli sort of achieved notoriety by increasing, I think it was from about $17.50 to $750, this pill Daraprim. Some of these price hikes by Concordia and Valeant were slightly more subtle. They might be several 100%, but they'd happen every 6 months or more regularly. And so the overall increase in absolute terms was very significant. And to fuel this growth, they were just constantly looking to make more and more acquisitions. So this company, Concordia, eventually bought a company in the UK called Amco, which had been created by the private equity house Cinven a few years earlier, and was essentially taking drugs that had already been price hiked and looking to price hike them further. And eventually that sort of house of cards, the music stopped, and they suddenly had huge amounts of debt and products that weren't worth anywhere near what they paid for them. But that sort of pricing model, I mean, is just a more extreme version of what a lot of big pharmaceutical companies do, particularly in the US, where annual price hikes for branded medicines have become very common. And it was responding to, I think, this one of the factors in those annual price hikes becoming common, which is this, as it was then in sort of 2010 or so, a long-term slump in R&D productivity, which meant that you could, very validly point to graphs that showed that the increased spend on R&D was not being matched by an increased number of drugs coming out the other end. And so, there was a legitimate argument, and maybe not a moral argument, but a legitimate argument to say it's not worth investing in R&D. R&D is the big drain on the balance sheet. If we can do without that and just have products that other people have already developed many years earlier, and we can price hike, we can kick off a lot of cash in a short period of time. And often alongside that, there were various deals and things to ensure that they had a monopoly over these drugs, or close to a monopoly. But it was a sort of short-term, get-rich-quick version of wider trends in terms of what other companies, larger companies, had been doing already. Yeah,
and it's kind of interesting that people traditionally look at innovation as a general good, but clearly there's innovation in lots of ways that are not good, and that almost outside-in financial incentive became pretty strong as soon as Wall Street and others began to look at the sort of spreadsheet opportunities that way. And I think you described very well the kind of the personalities involved, and the do you think it was force of personality, or do you think it was a problem that was just sitting there waiting for someone to notice?
I think it was probably inevitable that someone would spot the opportunity here, because it was just a sort of more extreme version of the way things were going already. And I think there's a role played by lots of different parties. Banks stood to gain from this and made a lot of fees from the acquisitions. They were encouraged more and more aggression. Management consultancies were often involved in the same way. And in a way, it's a rational, it's a rational response to a market inefficiency, effectively. So, the sort of business school playbook, this is what you should be doing in this situation. It's just that, the pharmaceutical industry is not like other industries. It's not, a car part that, or a type of crisp that someone can do without. And so, you cause profound problems for patients and healthcare systems when you have this sort of behavior on the scale that we saw it.
Yeah, and I think, given a lot of our industry sits in the States, I think they might be surprised that your journey started in the UK, where you'd imagine that the kind of single payer system would spot this and stop this happening. But you mentioned the kind of £1 billion cost of ignoring it. Do you see it as a bigger issue or globally, or does it have sort of highlights?
I think it's definitely a global issue. I mean, we've seen it happen in all around Europe. I think in South Africa, obviously in the US and Canada as well. I'm sure if you went looking for it in other countries, it would be there. I think it is interesting that the UK. Certainly, I think you're right that the view from the US is that you've got this single payer system, and so these sorts of abuses don't occur. We now have slideshows and lots of internal documents from some of these British companies that were doing it, and they specifically outlined why they thought this would work, which is that the NHS, the British National Health Service, have quite limited resources in terms of the number of officials looking at this sort of thing. They are focused on the big ticket items in the same way that for a long time insurers and PBMs in the US were too. And so this sort of stuff is under the radar. They're not paying attention to a medicine that is 40 years old. They're sort of hoping broadly that the generics market works, and it does deliver a lot of savings alongside these sort of abuses. And effectively they were asleep at the wheel for many years. I think the companies involved were surprised it lasted as long as it did. I mean, I think one of the reasons the price rises were so aggressive is that they thought, we may have a year or 2 years until another company comes into the market, or the Department of Health cottons on to what's going on. But they didn't for years.
Interesting. So there's a sort of tragedy of the commons sort of type approach. Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to explore this with you as you get further on in the book as well, because we've got Peter Kolczynski on here talking through his book and the idea that if we're going to have generics, we should do it properly. We should have a social contract to make sure that we're comfortable with genericization of our drugs when it gets there. But clearly that we're in this hinterland at the moment where you can have a Humira dragging on for a long time as a sort of global drug. We'll get to your proposed solutions, but do you think that's got to be part of where we end up?
Absolutely, and I think I think the concept of a social contract is a really useful one in illustrating what's gone wrong. I think if you and I think it's particularly interesting in light of the history of sort of patents and medicines and the initial opposition to allowing patents on the medicines themselves, on naturally occurring substances, the medical establishment's opposition to getting involved with the industry in the early years, because it believed that it was immoral to be constraining scientific knowledge in this way. So I think if you think of patents as part of a social contract in which obviously that incentivizes the investment in R&D into clinically useful new products, there is a reasonable return on investment for a specified period, and then after that, and this is the crucial bit, medicines go off patent, generics come into the market, they become cheap or commodity-like products, and that frees up the money for health systems to invest in the next generation of innovation. And the problem, I think, the problems essentially stem from that social contract being distorted. You mentioned Humira. You have these huge issues now with that sort of originally envisaged patent term being artificially extended through patent thickets or deals or whatever the specific mechanism is. And then on the other side of the equation, if old medicines are no longer necessarily cheap, which is not just an issue with price hiking of old medicines, it's also an issue with the lack of biosimilars and the kind of scientific challenges there, then you don't have that balance, and you have a business model which essentially isn't sustainable anymore, doesn't work anymore, because you can't expect healthcare systems to infinitely increase their budgets. That's not a sustainable model. So I think that unbalancing is what's gone wrong. That's the distortion, and that's kind of a useful starting point when we think about what needs to be fixed.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe let's take a journey through, because I mean you've got a great chapter dedicated to AZT, the first AIDS drug, the kind of repurposing and the kind of speed of development of drugs there. Can you explain your starting point there?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting case study, and I think it had quite a lot of significance for what followed. A lot of lessons that were sort of learnt on both sides. But AZT, as you said, is the first AIDS drug. I mean, I think ultimately people look back now and say it really wasn't a great drug at all. It was quite toxic, and ultimately its clinical value is, I think, quite debatable in hindsight, although it's since had uses as part of cocktails and other things. But that was the first drug, that was the first treatment available for this new disease, which was causing so many deaths, and as you say, it was quite a rapid turnaround from discovering its use in this purpose and getting it onto the market. It's an interesting illustration of the collaboration between the private sector and the public sector, which is so instrumental to this industry. And particularly, I mean, I kind of really highlighted it from a pricing perspective. It is the first drug that really provoked a huge backlash over the pricing, and ultimately it was a successful activism campaign which halved and then went even further in lowering the price. But the lessons that were taken from that were not that we need to be pricing needs, well, lots of lessons that could have been taken around how pricing is approached, who was involved in that decision, and what level that's set at. But I think instead the industry ultimately saw in that what they needed to do to avoid falling into the same traps in terms of funding patient groups themselves to have an element of control. The way in which pricing was presented and described, and the arguments that got developed in that respect, and then all sorts of other sort of related lessons in terms of the kind of management of the issue from a kind of PR perspective, but not from the kind of core perspective of here was a drug, the only treatment available, and it was priced at a level which was unaffordable for a huge proportion of patients for a number of years.
Which, if you roll forward to 2022, I mean, I know the arguments about COVID being over are slightly sort of disingenuous. When was it 4/5 of the planet still hasn't had a first dose of vaccine, for a number of reasons. But it'd be good to explore with some numbers around this, because your chapter on how to price a drug was sort of illuminating as well, that clearly price is what someone's prepared to pay, but it's not what everyone's prepared to pay. It's what some people are prepared to pay. So could you give us some sort of some background on that?
Yeah, so I think one of the people I interviewed in the book is a guy called Mick Kalasa, who was a sort of early proponent of pharmacoeconomics in the US, and a sort of pricing guru, if you like, who was often brought in by drug companies to help advise on how they approach pricing. I think it's useful to sort of separate how the industry often presents its pricing approach from what it actually happens behind the scenes, and I don't think it's particularly helpful to either side, the sort of gap that's developed there. But for a long time the argument was always the pricing is set on because the R&D is really expensive, lots of drugs don't work, we need to recoup that cost in order to fund future medicines. This is why one high number leads to another high number. This is why the drug is priced as it is. What we can actually see from AZT at that point, they I think the chairman described it as sticking a finger in the wind. I mean, they were just totally guessing what they could get away with that, with the price of that drug. There was no, there's no direct comparison. That there was nothing else on the market, so there was no precedent set. What happened, I think, in the wake of AZT, particularly in the 90s, and particularly linked to developments that weren't, unintended consequences around the legislation for the orphan drugs, the Orphan Drug Act, which incentivized or sought to incentivize the development of treatments for rare diseases, and which led to drugs which were very highly priced, far beyond the norms of medicines pricing at that time. That's right. I really appreciate I'm jumping around a bit now, but for various reasons, those drugs were very expensive, not least because some of the early orphan drugs were genuinely very expensive to make, just in terms of manufacturing costs. But what gradually happened is companies realized that these biotechs, these companies that were pushing the envelope on pricing, weren't getting the level of blowback that we'd seen with AZT. In part, they were managing things better. In part, they were, some of these orphan drugs had quite small patient numbers, and so they weren't causing the ripples that a mass market drug would. And people like Mick Colassa were making the case that most drugs were woefully underpriced, that the biggest barrier to higher prices at that point was drug companies, and drug companies' fear of being the next Burroughs Wellcome, which is the company that made AZT, and having protesters breaking into their offices and being plastered all over the evening news. But actually, especially in the US, pricing inelasticity was there and wasn't being exploited. That the pushback from payers was fairly minimal, and people were willing to pay these prices, and therefore you're leaving money on the table if you don't do it. And they evolved a whole kind of playbook of how to justify these prices, which I think moved gradually from R&D is really expensive to look how valuable these drugs are. What would what price would you put on a life? What price would you put on 3 months of extra health? And the problem with those arguments is that it's a completely movable feast. I mean, you can manipulate those numbers really to say anything you want. So then it really became a test of, well, how much are you, what's your stomach for a fight, and how much are you willing to push the envelope? And companies found there wasn't much fight, and so over the course of the 90s into the 2000s, that approach that I think was particularly initially pursued by biotechs, which often had orphan drugs, but also didn't have a kind of wider legacy of medicines that they payers could punish them on if they didn't like the price of one drug, started to really increase prices, and then that spread across the industry, and that was accompanied by this gradual fall in R&D productivity, which meant we've got to make up the gap somewhere, and pricing became a lever with which to do that.
Yeah, and certainly I think there's an expectation that the pressure on the system would be, the buyers and the providers of drugs would be in tension, but as Peter Kolczynski's book and others have pointed out, that's not necessarily true, because some of these middlemen are, more than happy for the price of drugs to go up because they make more money with them going up, and some of the prescribers themselves are incentivized to prescribe certain classes over others. So some of the kind of natural market constraints that you might expect are not, and certainly less true now than they were even 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's very true. And obviously, I mean, that's really the core of that problem is the US market. And as you say, there are specific programs and schemes which cover certain types of drugs. So I think infused cancer drugs are one of them, where, because of the way reimbursement works in hospitals, doctors are incentivized to prescribe the more expensive option. And as you say, PBMs sitting as middlemen in the middle of all this have also had sort of misaligned incentives and have claimed a kind of larger and larger share over the years. I mean, that's one of the reasons price hiking was possible, is because, and certainly for sort of annual price increases for sort of mass market branded drugs with a single supplier, because if you set a higher list price and you increase your list price, you can give a larger discount to the PBMs, no matter that in absolute terms you're increasing costs for everyone. So yes, the US market is astonishingly broken, really. I kind of explore that in one of the chapters, and researching that was pretty eye-opening in just how, it's not just that Medicare doesn't negotiate the price of medicines and has to carry and has to cover most all medicines in I think it's 6 categories, and including cancer drugs. It's also, as you say, all these other schemes which incentivize all sorts of players to increase prices and to not push back against others. And obviously the US market is incredibly important for the pharmaceutical industry. It is it is the thing, it is the engine that's driving it. It is incentivizing everything through the whole sort of life cycle of drug development in terms of where the money goes. It's why we have so many drugs now that are cancer treatments or treatments for rare diseases. So many that they're struggling to fill clinical trials because they haven't got enough patients to do them all. And that everyone pays the cost of that, because even if we're not paying the same prices as the US, it pushes up expectations, and relatively speaking, and
limits the drugs that we get. I think that I mean, in reality, if a drug might be suitable for, say, the Northeastern United States or the West Coast, great. If it's not, then it's deprioritized in R&D. And to the point about the spreadsheet guys, the financial guys, the Shkreli's of the world, I mean, those might be easy price decisions, but pharma companies in development will make decisions about infusion versus oral therapies because of the pricing setup that there is and the incentive structure that there is. So it doesn't affect decisions in R&D.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, it's just walking through the book, then, there's this chapter, Dirty Pharma, which I'd love you to talk more about. Obviously, that was a more provocative one for me, but I'd love to hear your elaboration.
Yeah, so that's really looking at that element of the social contract that's been distorted in terms of the duration to which new medicines get a monopoly, and the kind of various toolkits that companies have developed to artificially extend that, and therefore to sort of reap the rewards for much longer. And I think it's worth thinking about the money that healthcare systems are therefore spending for longer periods of time on those medicines, and what that's incentivizing. And because of the sort of time value of money and the discount rate on future income, those extra years are playing very little role in the early stage investors of a startup deciding to go, we'll put some money into this candidate drug in whatever area it is, type of cancer or whatever it might be. But it is draining huge amounts of revenue out of the system. And so, that chapter is sort of Dirty Pharma in relation to the kind of dirty tricks that have been developed. And the novelty, and there's incredible innovation in the legal departments and the marketing departments of pharmaceutical companies. I think there was a fairly recent example, I'm trying to remember which company it was, that did it, where they were attempting to assign a patent to an Indian tribe to take advantage of sovereign immunity rules. There's been
Allegan?
I think that might be right. Yeah, that sounds right. There's all sorts of complaining to the regulator because a generic that is about to launch has used a different type of orange juice as part of its comparison, that seeking patents for left knee pain as opposed to just knee pain. It also, the ways in which scientific developments in cancer have allowed, changed our understanding really of cancer. It's no longer just lung cancer as one type, but the way in which companies have been able to use that to apply for orphan drug status on medicines that are already on the market and selling in the billions. But here is a new niche, or in reverse, start with the orphan drug status, apply the pricing that applies in that area, but then know that it's going to actually have a much wider patient base. So there's lots of tales of
and I think
of naughty behavior, if you like, by drug companies.
Yeah, no, and I think, one of the challenges is when it's presented as starkly as that, it feels like somebody else is doing it. But we've all been in those meetings where, you think about, how you might launch a drug, and then because the price comes down, it doesn't tend to go up after you launch. So you think of indication selection. I think the move towards orphan and rare disease R&D, it's easier, so it's easier to get stuff through the pipeline. But as you say, the reward at the other side is a lot higher. But we're ignoring a lot of the population in doing that at the same time.
And there's some companies have financial incentives for executives that are linked to these sorts of areas. There's all sorts. The market has never punished a drug company for overpricing a medicine. The incentives are all aligned in one direction, and as you say, it's therefore easy to see why in meetings this sort of outcome is inevitable. I mean, I think one of the interesting things actually from some of the people I interviewed for the book is kind of how the culture has changed within pharmaceutical companies, and particularly the sort of diminished role of scientists. So scientists are now very rarely in top executive jobs. They're much more likely to be drawn from sales backgrounds or legal backgrounds or even management consultants. A lot of the of CEOs of those price hiking companies that we talked about at the beginning were management consultants who were applying that kind of logic to other industries and moved across to pharma. And so I suppose in some ways a sort of moral dimension of this is in it, that sort of scientific ideal of the pursuit of knowledge and the benefit of mankind gets lost when it's replaced by people that are coming from a business school background with a laser focus on trimming costs and maximizing rewards, and that's what the system and the market is set up to encourage them to do and reward them for doing. So that it's not one. I don't really pin the blame on any one individual with these decisions, because that's what's expected of them.
Yeah, I think it's always fair to blame McKinsey at some point. I think it seems that I think it's reasonable, because I think you contrast in the book the kind of Roy Vagelos type era with today. I mean, I think there are still a few of his ilk around, but they have that context, right? Sitting around them, there are people who might have jumped from one company to another.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to look back actually at the sort of birth of the modern industry, which I would really put with the race for penicillin and the sort of aftermath of the Second World War. And penicillin, in contrast to COVID, was the sort of race to be able to mass produce penicillin was built on collaboration. I mean, a number of large drug companies were involved on both sides of the Atlantic, but particularly in the US. They worked together, they shared knowledge. There was obviously government scientists involved as well. And penicillin was then available at scale very cheaply. And so were several of the first the kind of antibiotics that followed. It was only going into the 1950s that drug companies realized the royalties that they were getting if they'd been the one to discover an antibiotic, which they'd then licensed out to several other companies, were quite low, and actually it would be much more profitable to exclusively to keep exclusivity and only sell it themselves. And across various classes of drugs, we can see that change from the first generation to the second generation, where the first generation was licensed out to several companies and was pretty cheap, and the second generation wasn't and was more expensive. But I think I don't think it's a coincidence that in the wake of a global, of World War II, of a global war, and the sort of remaking of society that followed, that there was a genuine spirit of kind of public spirited behavior and the kind of idea of the moral corporation, which I think was what Roy Vagelos called his book, and that that has gradually faded as companies became more financially focused, as Wall Street and management consultants got their teeth in and changed the culture and incentives. And that's not unique to the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, that is a change that's happened in lots of industries. It's just that the pharmaceutical industry has this, I think, special status and special responsibility.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, because I think you're right that I mean, I think we're aware of Volkswagen emissions scandal and other things where innovation and set of loopholes, set of legal constraints that were looked at and effectively managed, because they didn't do anything illegal. It was just fraudulent in many ways. Seeing those opportunities, I think it's common to every industry. But we've got a recent case study. If you look at AstraZeneca versus Pfizer with the vaccine, right? You do something which actually was pretty public spirited, and the question is whether anyone would do it again. In the next pandemic, would anyone go down the AstraZeneca path versus a Pfizer path? I suspect we've just been given that lesson by the US especially.
Yeah, I think that's totally. I think that sadly is probably true in terms of what would happen next time. I mean, I think there's some extent to which AstraZeneca didn't help themselves with some of the mistakes that were made and the ways in which those were disclosed and presented. But certainly, I mean, I don't think they've had the sort of PR reward, I suppose, for want of a better term, that they deserved for making that gesture. And similarly, I don't think Pfizer have any regrets about the approach they've taken and the pricing approach and the rest of it. I mean, there's all sorts of it's probably a topic for its own podcast, but the sort of lessons of the pandemic from an industry perspective, the amount of public funding that became available when it was apparent this was a serious problem. I don't see how that does anything to incentivize drug companies to be better prepared next time.
No, it's an interesting callback to the Pfizer penicillin story, right? That their ability to distribute, manufacture, scale, all the things that were important in World War II are just as important this time. And as a sort of central function of a drug company, there's a lot of companies that missed the opportunity to do that. The vaccine companies did for one. But now I wrote a piece a few months back about given that we started with 150 candidates in the vaccine race and about 4 or 5 made it through, we still don't know today whether they were the best 4 or 5. We just know they were the ones that won. And you'd think that would be a thing the industry could get hold of, is early on figuring out which are the best vaccines, and also having a good agreement on what best means. Is it cheap? Is it ability to store at room temperature? Those kinds of things. But people congratulating our industry, I think, should be looking at what we didn't get right as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and I think there's a strong element. It's very fortunate that the mRNA vaccines worked, and they didn't. That wasn't inevitable, and if they hadn't, then I think it's a very different picture. And the point you make there about the big existing vaccine manufacturers, I mean, the reality is they were very reluctant to get involved. They had been stung before with Ebola and other outbreaks where investments had been made, and by the time something had been ready, it was no longer a market for it. But it's a problem, and it's a problem for next time. And I think there are lots of problems. The nationalism that countries displayed in just making sure they could get even many multiples of the vaccine for their own populations to hedge their bets, while large parts of the world didn't have any, even though they were ultimately putting themselves at risk of variants developing that would come back to bite them. That was a sort of depressing turn of events, and is there any real reason to believe that wouldn't happen next time?
No, I think you're right. That's my big caution for everyone I speak to, is really that we need to recognize we might have been lucky this time rather than smart. And I think there's lots of people patting our industry on the back for what it did, but celebrating one win out of one game is not the that might not be the kind of end of it. But I'd be keen to get in the time we got, because I'm rambling a little bit here, but I love that idea of the kind of one-sided tug of war, the kind of leading to the drugs that we end up getting today. I mean, you've touched on that a little bit, but could you just give us some depth on those chapters?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the other big sort of transformation that's occurred alongside a kind of change in pricing and attitudes to pricing, and kind of how far companies have been willing to push the envelope on that, particularly in the US, is the effect that these cultural changes has had on the types of drug we get, and on the way R&D is done, and on the extent to which it became a kind of target-based approach that companies said, we want, well, companies moved to high throughput screening particularly, and said we want to, we can now do 10,000 in a day instead of 1,000, and therefore we're going to suddenly have loads more drugs, and that ultimately didn't prove to be the case, because the predictive models were more important than that kind of brute force approach. But alongside that, R&D became much more closely aligned with the kind of commercial side, and products were not being developed if they weren't expected to be $1 billion blockbuster or a $2 billion. I think it was a Novartis that came out this month or last month and said we're only going to do projects that we think are going to be $2 billion or more a year. Now that's
classic McKinsey nonsense. But, yeah.
Well, exactly. So that doesn't work. I mean, you don't know what's going to work commercially or scientifically at that early stage, and often some of the biggest anticipated launches have been flops, and some of the drugs that they didn't think would be very useful have actually turned out to be very good at something else, and then suddenly they're a blockbuster. But I think also that sort of narrow approach of we're going to try and find something in this area because our existing drug in this area is running out of the patent life, even with all these tricks we've used, and we want to sort of buttress the franchise, have the next version. That leads to a huge amount of wasted R&D funding and scientific effort, and also to drugs that aren't very novel or aren't very clinically useful, because the best they can do is do a very minor tweak that just gets around the hurdle of getting a new patent, but doesn't really advance anything. And some of the interesting things. One of the interesting things I thought from someone I spoke to in the book who was at Eli Lilly for many years, and who has studied innovation, was that this idea that there are sort of bursts in different areas. That there are development in the basic science, which mean one area becomes ripe for drug discovery, and then that sort of well gets exhausted and it moves on to somewhere else, and that approach, that scientific reality means that if you try and impose from above for commercial reasons what you kind of want out of R&D by therapy area or product value, you're just going to end up with a huge number of failures, and I think that that really contributed to that slump in R&D productivity, alongside the fact that you were getting candidate drugs that were too similar, so one would fail and then they would all fail because they don't have the same issue. And where that's ended up is that we now have the majority of new drugs, I think it was maybe 75% of new drugs in 2018 were in the US, were either orphan drugs or cancer drugs or both. We've now getting some very good cancer drugs, but for a period a lot of the new cancer drugs had pretty low clinical benefits. I mean, at best a sort of progression-free rate of a few weeks or a few months, and also cancer drugs and orphan drugs are the highest priced medicines, and so if 3/4 of your new medicines are in those areas, it presents a huge burden for healthcare systems, not to mention the areas that aren't getting the investment, of which vaccines was one such area for many years. That's the reason why there weren't very many large vaccine manufacturers by the time COVID hit. So these kind of changes, these cultural changes, these scientific challenges, these pricing changes have not just contributed to a situation in which affordability has become a real issue even for very rich countries. They've also contributed to a situation in which we don't necessarily get the drugs that are most clinically useful, and we get drugs in a relatively narrow range of therapy areas, which doesn't necessarily follow the science, it follows the commercial incentives.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I wrote another piece called "The Light We Don't Shine" because I think there's lots of people studying equity and clinical trial research, but of course those are the studies we're doing. The ones we're not doing never get tracked anywhere, right? So the kind of major addressable issues are not being seen. But and then you sit that next to we do an annual innovation index looking at which companies are actually good at getting their pipelines to market. And one of the snapshots in that index is called the freshness index, and it looks at, which actually I borrowed from Bernard Munoz as a kind of idea a long time ago as a friend of mine. it looks at how much of last year's revenue comes from drugs you launched in the last 5 years and first launched in the last 5 years. And it's shocking how many of the top 30 are down at 0% or 1%, 2%. And it tells you if that's true and you're not deriving revenue from new drugs, you have to be deriving it from old drugs to be in that top 30%. And people will tell you that their life cycle strategy, their subsequent indication strategy that's fine because it's making up for it. That's R&D costs as well, and some of the R&D budget that they tell you that they're spending is going into that. So at least this kind of trolley problem of, do we kill, 5 new programs in order to keep the kind of one big fat one alive? And I think that's exactly what we're seeing in there. But the stats are quite shocking on, which companies are not deriving revenue from new products. Even the ones that are launching lots of them, they're to your point, they think they're targeting market opportunities, but that's a pretty underserved part of our industry as well.
I guess the other thing we should just touch on very briefly in relation to that is the transformation in the proportion of drugs that are developed sort of throughout in-house, and the move basically to an acquisition model of buying often startup biotechs who have developed a very promising candidate, maybe taken it through a phase 1 trial, perhaps even phase 2 as well, and then it's bought by a sort of big traditional drug maker to do the phase 3 and to price it and sell it. And that has an effect too on the types of research that gets done, because startups are always going to cluster into the most commercially viable areas. If you're an early stage investor and you've got someone with an interest in developing a cancer drug, that if they can get something that's even loosely clinically useful, that will not struggle to secure reimbursement. But whereas other areas might be much more difficult, and it also has an inflationary effect on pricing, because the company that's the winning bidder is the company that thinks it can charge the highest price and therefore is prepared to bid X amount. So I think that is also quite problematic. I think it's also a bit of a concern from an infrastructure perspective, because the kind of capital that's flowing to startup biotechs is those are investors that are likely to be active in a number of industries. And so if you had just for example very blunt pricing reform in the US, which said we're going to seek to halve the launch prices of new medicines, and then you then had a rush of capital to other areas, to other industries, you don't have the legacy infrastructure that large companies once did of they employ this number of scientists and they have these facilities, and they're therefore might as well put them to work doing something. Lots of that's just going to disappear.
Yeah, oh for sure. And I think it comes full circle to what we mean by pricing, because I think the price of new drugs, the price of drugs that should have gone generic, I think some of those things are able to be teased apart, right? That there may be some good arguments that the price of drugs is less important than some of the other things in the ecosystem, but it's certainly a major consideration for people who only look at spreadsheets. And I think there's lots of those now sitting around our industry. But I'd be keen to get to your kind of your fighting back and your plan for making what we do better.
Yeah, so I think there's lots of there are lots of possible solutions to lots of different aspects of the problems here. I don't think there is a one size fits all, and there certainly isn't an easy solution, as the littered history of attempted reform, particularly in the US, demonstrates. But I think at its core, it's about restoring that social contract and rebalancing the sort of power, if you like, between drug makers and the healthcare systems and patients and governments that in society that benefits from their products. So I think there is a lot that can be done in terms of removing abuses, particularly around to start with those sort of price hiked old medicines. There's a clear role there for regulators to step in, as they have done in a number of cases. I think there are arguments for the British health system having some form of generic manufacturing capacity as a sort of option of last resort. not least because there are other areas where generics have become so cheap that people have pulled out, and then you have supply shortages. I think there are reforms that could easily as well target the sort of dirty tricks we touched on in terms of patent thickets and evergreening. I mean, I think you can, there are a number of ways of going about that, whether it's setting a defined period of market exclusivity rather than being necessarily tied to the patent duration, whether you have enforced genericization or enforced price cuts at a certain point, whether you set a sort of revenue threshold above which you lose orphan drug status, or you lose exclusivity, or whatever exactly it may be. I think that there's clearly some rebalancing that needs to happen there. But I think the much thornier issue is around how do you price new medicines, and how do you balance the need to incentivize innovation with the need for access. To some extent, it's easy to point where it's gone wrong. It's actually quite hard to solve that in a sort of structural way. But I think there are certainly several obvious things, obvious places to start to basically restore rationality or a degree of rationality to that system, because prices have become very dependent on what the precedent is in that area. I mean, companies have broadly realized there's no real incentive with a new medicine to being cheap. Doctors won't use you just because you're cheap. They'll use you because you're a much better medicine than the existing medicine, or they'll use you because some patients will want to cycle through all the options available. So essentially, you have a sort of escalator effect where the existing treatment sets the sort of floor, and if you think you're a much better product, you set your own ceiling, if you like. So I think that there is a role there for health technology assessments, for sort of qualities and things like that, to be used to set ceilings there, and then there's a role for much more for beefed up negotiation, particularly in the US. I mean, I think Medicare needs to be able to negotiate the price of medicines. I think that there is a potential tool in the extent to which a lot of drugs rely on public research that hasn't been used, and then I think there are sort of novel payment solutions that solve a kind of related but slightly separate issue, which is really a cash flow issue for drugs that are very good but have a large number of patients that will benefit, or are like gene therapies, for example, just very expensive on a per patient basis. And I think we're starting to see some quite interesting solutions in that respect. There was the Australian government's approach to Gilead's hepatitis C products, where it was a sort of, I think it's been described as a Netflix model. It's a sort of set fee, and then it's not linked to quantity. They can use the quantity of the drugs that they require for a set fee. And I think we're seeing something similar in the UK, at least on a pilot basis with antibiotics, where obviously for slightly different reasons, there's an incentive not to use that. We don't want to be using new antibiotics unless we absolutely need to, but at the same time we want to incentivize drug companies to develop them. So I think there are some interesting solutions there. I think there's some interesting stuff going on around better understanding what types of patients will benefit from a drug, and linking outcomes-based payments that we're starting, I think, with gene therapies, amongst other areas, we're already starting to see where this is the price, but only if we'll refund you if it doesn't work for this patient, because it is incredible how much isn't known about a medicine until it hits the market, and then even years later, we kind of, with use, really start to understand the types of patient groups that will benefit, those that don't, and there's huge inefficiency there. But ultimately, what all those things are sort of thinking about is more closely aligning prices to clinical usefulness, and giving healthcare systems tools to flag to drug companies, this is what we're interested in, this is what we'll reward, but also tools to tie their spending to benefits. And that may ultimately mean that pharmaceuticals, or novel chemical compounds or biological medicines, are not the principal focus of improving healthcare outcomes, that other avenues that aren't as lucrative at the moment because they don't have IP that applies in the same straightforward manner. Could be better incentivized, or we take the view that actually a better use of finite budgets is to maximize access to the many medicines we already have, and a decrease, although not a complete stop, on the number of new medicines that are produced each year is actually, and ultimately in society's interest. You have kind of some of those arguments quickly get become very emotional, very emotive, putting prices on the life and that sort of thing. But that's the sort of decisions that's made in all kinds of, from whether we build road safety barriers to traffic lights to everything. There's always cost benefit analysis, and we are effectively already putting a price on these things, and when that price is so expensive that big rich Western countries aren't paying for new cancer drugs because they can't afford them, not because they don't think they're useful, or whatever the exact therapy area may be, that that's already happening, and that's already a problem. So
yeah, it's a challenge. I'm hoping that the UK sees itself as a kind of test bed for some of these ideas, because it's got almost a unique ecosystem to trial this. So no, it's interesting. I'm aware that I'm well over time already, Billy. A question that I didn't let you know I was going to ask you, but recommended reading, anything that you'd like to, that you'd direct people towards, that you found particularly illuminating?
That's a good question. Well, there's quite a lot of things I found interesting, and there's some very extensive endnotes in the book that point to some of those books and things. I mean, I think some of the thinkers doing interesting work on this, I think some of the people you've had on the podcast, but Jack Scannell is someone I spoke to at length, both for interviewing for the book, but also just sort of formulating thoughts and ideas around some of these issues. He hasn't written a book, but he's written some very interesting papers. So that's certainly one. And now scrambling to single out some others, but there's a lot of interesting work. I mean, there's quite a lot of people in the industry. You mentioned Peter Koscielny, who has written an interesting book. There are others in the last few years who have offered thoughts on similar themes. I think it's quite encouraging that there's a more rational debate being had in this area. I think it's easy for this argument to be just discussions around drug pricing and access and innovation to become a very simplistic. You're charging too high, we're going to cut drug prices, versus if you do that, we won't have any innovation. And those, it is not the case, and the book does not argue that we can't. If we should just cut drug prices arbitrarily and bluntly, and there will be no issues that drug companies are lying. They've got plenty of money. They're doing stock buybacks and the rest of it. Those are symptoms of R&D productivity issues. They aren't. They're not solutions. And so I think it's encouraging that there's more. Some of the nuances that are required in this debate are kind of coming to the fore. More than maybe 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, and said thank you for writing a book with nuance. I think that the risk of when you see these things on Amazon is that there's lots of people who would just have taken a polarized, one-sided view, and you haven't done that. You've given me some things I didn't know about our history, and some thoughtful approaches going forwards. Billy, if someone wants to find out more about you, where would you point them?
So I've got a website which is billykenber.com, but probably the best place to find me is on Twitter, which is at Billy Kenber, Ken for November, BER, where you will find whatever I'm currently working on for the Times, which is not necessarily pharma related, but it's an area that I've been coming back to and will continue to come back to, because I think it's a very interesting area. It's an important area. There's plenty that's gone wrong, and plenty of of abuses and some misbehavior that you know, is fertile territory for someone like me as an investigative journalist. But I think, you know, clearly, as we've touched on, it's a very important industry. It does a lot of very important things, and it's that role that, you know, makes these arguments so significant, and why it's important to get it right. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in the US in terms of potential pricing reforms there that have got, you know, very bogged down in internal politics of the Democratic Party, but there is nevertheless potential for some change there. I think, yeah. Well, I was going to say that to some extent, I think that the kind of the industry has heeded to some extent the message on some of these issues. Pricing has been a lot less aggressive in the last few years than in the kind of 5 or 10 years before that. But I think if you look back over the last 20 or 30 years, it's hard not to conclude that that is a brief, you know, a temporary pause rather than a recognition of fundamental change.
Yeah, for sure. Excellent. Billy, thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to the next one, hopefully with Jack and Bernard and a few other ideas on positive change as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Idea Collider. To continue the conversation, visit our website at ideapharma.com. Follow us in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcast. Until next time, I'm Mike Rea, wishing you great success.